My name is Claire Doyle. I'm 33 years old. For nearly 2 years, my mother-in-law, Susan, has told anyone who'd listen, her sisters, her friends, the entire extended family, that I controlled my husband Ryan into cutting off contact with his family, that I'd isolated him deliberately, that the man she raised would never have pulled away on his own. I never once told Ryan he couldn't see his family. I never blocked a number, deleted a contact, or said a single word discouraging him from reaching out. 3 weeks ago, Ryan's sister Kelly was cleaning out an old phone and found a group chat none of us had looked at in over a year, a chat Ryan had started himself, 18 months earlier, sending message after message asking his mother and sister to please, just once, come to dinner, to meet him halfway, to stop making every visit feel like a performance review. Nobody in that chat ever responded. Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever been blamed for someone else's choice to pull away, comment "that wasn't me" below. This one's for you. Ryan and I met 5 years ago, married 3 years into our relationship, and built, from the very beginning, a partnership that I'd always considered genuinely healthy, open communication, mutual respect, and a shared understanding that neither of us would ever try to control the other's relationships with their own family. I want to describe Ryan's family dynamic before I entered the picture, because I think understanding it clearly matters to everything that eventually unfolded. Ryan's mother, Susan, had always been, by his own description, a demanding presence throughout his childhood and young adulthood, deeply involved in his life in ways that occasionally tipped into what Ryan himself, even before we met, described as controlling. His sister Kelly, for years younger, had developed a considerably more compliant relationship with their mother, one built, I think, on a specific pattern of accommodation that Ryan had never quite been willing to fully adopt himself. Ryan had told me, early in our relationship, about a specific pattern that had existed for years before I ever entered the picture: Susan's tendency to critique his life choices extensively, to compare him unfavorably to Kelly's more accommodating relationship with her, and to treat any pushback from Ryan as evidence of some character flaw rather than a reasonable boundary. I remember one specific story Ryan told me, early in our relationship, about a Thanksgiving during his college years when he'd brought a girlfriend home for the first time. Susan had spent much of the visit asking pointed questions about the girlfriend's career ambitions, her family background, her long-term plans, in a manner Ryan described as making both him and his girlfriend feel genuinely uncomfortable throughout the entire visit. That relationship, he told me, hadn't survived much longer past that Thanksgiving, and Ryan had always privately wondered how much his mother's scrutiny had contributed to its ending, even as he'd never directly confronted her about it at the time. I met Susan for the first time about 4 months into dating Ryan, an introduction that I want to describe honestly, because I think my own early impressions matter to understanding how this entire situation eventually unfolded. Susan was, from that very first meeting, warm on the surface but carrying a specific undercurrent of evaluation that I noticed almost immediately: questions about my career, my family background, my long-term intentions with Ryan, delivered with a particular intensity that felt less like genuine curiosity and more like an assessment I was being subjected to without having agreed to it. I want to be fair to Susan in describing this, because I don't think her behavior, in isolation, was necessarily malicious. Many parents, I understand, feel a specific protectiveness toward adult children entering serious relationships. But over the following months and years, I noticed a pattern considerably more pointed than ordinary protective curiosity: specific comments about how Ryan had changed since meeting me, comparisons to relationships she considered more ideal, a general framing that positioned any independence Ryan demonstrated as evidence of my negative influence rather than his own adult agency. I want to describe one specific early dinner with Susan, roughly 6 months into dating Ryan, because I think it captured, in miniature, the exact dynamic that would eventually calcify into her false narrative years later. At this dinner, I mentioned, casually, that Ryan and I were considering moving in together, a decision that felt, to both of us, like a natural next step after several months of a genuinely serious relationship. Susan's reaction was immediate and pointed: a lengthy series of questions about whether we'd really thought this through, whether Ryan understood what he was giving up in terms of his independence, whether I understood what I was asking of him. I remember feeling, even that early in our relationship, a specific discomfort at being positioned as someone making demands of Ryan, rather than simply someone making a mutual decision alongside him. Ryan, for his part, gently redirected the conversation that evening, telling his mother that this was a decision we'd made together, as equal partners. I noted, even then, how much effort that gentle redirection seemed to cost him, and how quickly Susan moved past the moment without any genuine acknowledgement of what he'd actually said. I want to describe, based on everything Ryan had shared with me over the years, exactly what his relationship with his mother had looked like before I ever entered his life, because I think it's essential to understanding that the eventual estrangement had roots considerably older than our marriage. Ryan had described, more than once, a specific pattern from his 20s, Susan's tendency to show up unannounced at his apartment, to critique his career choices extensively, to insert herself into decisions that Ryan felt should have been entirely his own to make. He'd described a particular incident, years before we met, when Susan had shown up at his workplace uninvited to check on him after he'd gone a week without calling her back promptly enough. I want to be clear that I never witnessed these earlier incidents directly. I'm relaying what Ryan told me, in the context of explaining, early in our relationship, why his relationship with his mother required certain boundaries that predated me entirely. This context matters enormously to what happened later, once Susan began constructing an entirely different narrative about the origins of the distance between herself and her son. I want to describe one specific example from our own wedding planning, roughly a year before the events central to this story, because I think it illustrates clearly how Susan's dynamic with Ryan operated well before any actual estrangement developed. Susan had strong opinions about nearly every aspect of our wedding, the venue, the guest list, even specific details of the ceremony itself, opinions she expressed with a specific intensity that occasionally created real tension during what should have been an uncomplicated, joyful planning process. Ryan, wanting to avoid unnecessary conflict, often deferred to several of these opinions even when they didn't match what either of us actually wanted, a pattern of accommodation I noticed him falling into throughout the entire planning process. I remember, specifically, a disagreement about the guest list, where Susan had insisted on inviting several distant relatives neither Ryan nor I felt close to, framing any pushback from us as evidence that we didn't value family the way we should. Ryan ultimately gave in on this particular point, exhausted, he told me privately, by the prospect of continued conflict over what felt, to him, like a relatively minor detail not worth the emotional cost of further disagreement. I want to emphasize this pattern, because it directly contradicts any narrative suggesting I encouraged Ryan toward conflict or distance with his mother. If anything, throughout our engagement and early marriage, I watched him repeatedly accommodate Susan's wishes, often more than either of us genuinely wanted to, specifically to avoid the tension that seemed to arise whenever he asserted any independent preference. I want to describe, honestly, how the actual distance between Ryan and his mother developed over our marriage, because the timeline matters enormously to understanding how false Susan's eventual public narrative would turn out to be. In our first year of marriage, Ryan and I visited his family regularly, monthly dinners, holiday gatherings, the ordinary rhythm of maintaining family connection. I want to be honest that these visits were rarely entirely comfortable, given Susan's persistent pattern of subtle criticism, but Ryan and I both made a genuine, sustained effort to maintain the relationship despite that discomfort. The distance that eventually developed grew gradually, driven, as far as I could observe directly, considerably more by Ryan's own accumulating frustration than by anything I ever said or did to discourage the relationship. I remember Ryan coming home from visits increasingly drained, describing specific comments Susan had made, critiques of our home, questions about when we'd have children delivered with a pointedness that felt more like pressure than genuine interest, comparisons to Kelly's more accommodating choices that Ryan found genuinely wearing over time. I want to be direct about what my actual role was during this period of growing distance, because it stands in complete contrast to what Susan would eventually tell her extended family and friends. I never once told Ryan he shouldn't visit his mother. I never expressed relief when visits were cancelled, never suggested he limit contact, never positioned myself as an alternative to his family relationships. If anything, I found myself, more than once, encouraging Ryan to maintain the connection despite his own growing frustration, understanding, even as an outside observer, how much he genuinely wanted a functional relationship with his mother, however difficult that relationship had become. I remember specific conversations where I'd gently push back when Ryan suggested skipping a family event, reminding him that maintaining the relationship, even an imperfect one, mattered to him in ways I understood and respected. This is, I think, the single most important fact underlying this entire story. I was consistently, actively encouraging connection, not discouraging it. Throughout the entire period, Susan would later claim I'd orchestrated a deliberate isolation. I want to describe a specific incident, roughly 18 months before this story's turning point, that I believe became the actual catalyst for Ryan's eventual pulling away, since I think understanding this moment clarifies exactly how disconnected Susan's later narrative was from what actually happened. At a family dinner, Susan made a comment, in front of several extended family members, suggesting that Ryan's career choices reflected poorly on how she'd raised him, comparing him unfavorably to a cousin who'd pursued a more conventionally prestigious path. Ryan, who'd absorbed similar comments for years without much visible reaction, responded that evening with a directness I hadn't seen from him before, telling his mother, calmly but firmly, that comments like that needed to stop. Susan's reaction to this pushback was immediate and severe. She left the dinner in visible distress, called Ryan later that night accusing him of humiliating her in front of family, and initiated what became, over the following months, an increasingly cold, distant dynamic that Ryan found himself unable to fully repair despite genuine, repeated attempts. I want to describe, in detail, the specific efforts Ryan made to repair this relationship over the following year, because these efforts represent the exact opposite of the narrative Susan would eventually construct about our marriage. Ryan called his mother regularly during this period, genuinely trying to smooth over the tension from that dinner, offering apologies for his own tone even as he maintained that the underlying boundary he'd asked for was reasonable. He extended repeated invitations for dinner at our own home, hoping a change of setting might ease the tension that had developed. He reached out to Kelly directly, asking her to help mediate, to encourage their mother towards some kind of reconciliation. I witnessed all of this directly, sitting beside Ryan during several of these calls, watching him genuinely work to repair a relationship that was, by every observable measure, considerably more important to him than Susan's eventual narrative would suggest. I never once discouraged these efforts. If anything, I actively supported them, understanding how much this relationship mattered to my husband regardless of how difficult it had become. I want to describe the specific group chat that would eventually become central to correcting Susan's false narrative, because its actual contents directly contradict everything she would claim. About 18 months before this story's turning point, frustrated by the difficulty of reaching his mother and sister individually, Ryan created a group text including himself, Susan, and Kelly, hoping a shared space might make coordination easier and reduce the specific tension that seemed to arise more easily in one-on-one conversations. I remember Ryan showing me the messages he sent in that chat, in real time, as he sent them, genuine, specific invitations. Can we do dinner this Sunday? I really want us to find our way back to something easier. I know things have been tense. I want you both to know our door is always open. Mom, I love you. I want this to work. Please just meet me halfway. Neither Susan nor Kelly ever responded in that chat. Not once, across dozens of messages Ryan sent over several months, genuinely trying to rebuild a connection he clearly still wanted. I want to describe what eventually happened to that group chat, because its fate matters to understanding why it remained undiscovered for so long, until Kelly's accidental rediscovery finally brought it back into relevance. After several months of unanswered messages, Ryan eventually stopped sending new ones, understanding, with a specific, quiet grief I watched him process in real time, that continuing to reach out into complete silence wasn't sustainable for his own well-being. He didn't delete the chat, he simply stopped engaging with it, letting it sit, and used, on his phone, a specific artifact of genuine effort that had gone entirely unacknowledged. I want to be clear that this period, the months of silence following Ryan's unanswered outreach, was the actual origin of the more significant distance that eventually developed. Not any action or encouragement on my part, but Ryan's own accumulating exhaustion at extending genuine effort into a relationship that refused, repeatedly and consistently, to meet him even part way. I want to describe how Susan's public narrative about our marriage began circulating, because I think tracing its origin matters to understanding how thoroughly detached from reality it eventually became. About a year into this growing distance, I began hearing, secondhand through various family connections, that Susan had started describing our marriage, to her sisters and friends, in specific, damaging terms, that I'd taken her son away, that I was controlling and isolating, that the warm, connected relationship she'd once had with Ryan had been deliberately dismantled by my influence. I want to describe the specific disorientation of hearing this narrative for the first time, given how completely it inverted the actual sequence of events. I hadn't taken Ryan away from anything. I'd spent over a year actively encouraging him to maintain a relationship that his own mother had made increasingly difficult to sustain, watching him extend genuine, repeated effort into a silence that never once broke. I want to describe a conversation I had with my own mother, around this same period, because her outside perspective helped me process just how genuinely disorienting it was to be characterized so falsely by someone in my own extended family. I don't understand how she could say that, my mother told me, once I'd explained the situation in detail. You've talked to me about Ryan's visits with his mother for years. I remember you specifically encouraging him to go, more than once, even when you'd rather have had a quiet weekend at home together. I know, I told her. That's what makes it so strange. It's not just that the story is unflattering. It's that it's the literal opposite of what actually happened, and I don't have an easy way to prove that to people who weren't there. My mother was quiet for a moment. I think, eventually, the truth usually finds its way out, she said, even when it takes longer than you'd like. But I understand why that's cold comfort right now, knowing people are hearing something false about you in the meantime. I appreciated her perspective, even as it didn't fully resolve the specific, ongoing discomfort of knowing a damaging narrative was circulating without any immediate way to correct it. I want to be honest about why I didn't immediately, publicly correct this narrative once I first became aware of it, because I think the specific reasoning behind that choice matters to the rest of this story. I discussed the situation extensively with Ryan, both of us genuinely uncertain about the best path forward. Confronting Susan directly, we worried, might simply confirm her existing narrative. Any pushback from me could easily be reframed, in her account to others, as further evidence of my supposedly controlling nature. We decided, instead, to focus on our own actual relationship and well-being, trusting, perhaps naively, that the truth would eventually become clear without requiring active intervention on our part. This decision, I want to be honest, came at a real cost. Months of knowing a false, damaging narrative was circulating among extended family, without any direct way to correct it that didn't risk making the situation worse. I want to describe the specific circumstances of how Kelly eventually discovered the group chat, because the accidental, unplanned nature of this discovery matters to understanding how the correction finally happened. Kelly had been cleaning out an old phone, preparing to donate it, when she came across the messaging app still logged into her account, the old group chat with Ryan and their mother still visible in her message history. She told me later that she'd opened it almost absent-mindedly, expecting nothing significant, before beginning to scroll through months of messages she apparently hadn't fully registered or processed when they'd originally arrived. I don't think I ever actually read them carefully the first time, she admitted to me later. I remember seeing notifications, feeling like I didn't have the energy to deal with whatever tension was happening, and just letting them sit unread. I had no idea, until I actually sat down and read through everything properly, how much Ryan had actually been trying. I want to describe, in more specific detail, exactly what Kelly encountered as she scrolled back through those messages, because I think the accumulated weight of Ryan's repeated, unanswered outreach mattered enormously to how completely it eventually shifted her understanding. She told me later that she'd sat on her kitchen floor for nearly an hour, scrolling slowly through months of messages, watching a clear pattern emerge, Ryan's tone shifting gradually from hopeful invitation to visible, patient hurt to eventual, quiet resignation, all of it happening in a conversation neither she nor her mother had ever once engaged with directly. There was one message that really got me, Kelly told me. He'd written, "I don't know what else to say to get you both to respond. I just want us to be a family again." And then nothing. No response from either of us, not even an acknowledgement that we'd seen it. I read that message probably 5 times before I could fully process that I'd just let that sit there, unanswered, for over a year, without ever even registering what I was doing. She described feeling a specific, physical nausea, reading through the full timeline in one sitting rather than the fragmented, easy-to-ignore way the messages had originally arrived, spread out across weeks and months where it had been simple enough to let each individual message blur into the general, low-grade tension she'd been avoiding rather than confronting directly. I want to describe what happened once Kelly had fully processed what she'd found, because her subsequent conversation with their mother became the actual turning point that finally corrected the narrative. Kelly called Susan directly, reading her several of Ryan's messages from the chat, asking her mother, plainly, why she'd never responded to any of them. Ryan was asking us to come to dinner, Kelly told her. He said their door was always open. He said he loved you and wanted this to work. Mom, why didn't either of us ever say anything back? According to what Kelly later told me, Susan's initial response was defensive, suggesting she simply hadn't seen the messages, or had been too hurt at the time to respond. But Kelly, having now read the full timeline of Ryan's outreach, pushed back directly. This isn't what you've been telling everyone, she said. You've been saying Claire cut us off. These messages show Ryan trying, over and over, to keep us connected. That's not what isolation looks like. I want to describe Susan's initial response to being confronted with this evidence, because I think it illustrates something important about how thoroughly she'd committed to her preferred version of events, even in the face of direct contradiction. I don't understand why this matters so much, Susan reportedly told Kelly. Regardless of a few messages, the overall situation is still that we've barely seen Ryan in over a year. Something changed, and it wasn't me. Kelly, to her credit, didn't accept this deflection. Something did change, she told her mother. Ryan tried, repeatedly, 4 months, and neither of us responded. That's not Claire's doing. That's ours. I want to describe the phone call Kelly made to me directly, once she'd had this initial conversation with Susan, because it represented the first time anyone in Ryan's family had directly acknowledged the actual truth of what had happened. I need to apologize to you, Kelly told me, her voice carrying genuine distress. I've heard Mom's version of this for over a year, and I never once questioned it directly. I just found Ryan's messages from that group chat we all had. I had no idea how much he'd actually tried, or how completely we ignored it. I told her I appreciated her honesty, though I admitted, genuinely, how difficult the preceding year had been, knowing a false narrative was circulating without any clear way to correct it. I never told Ryan to stop trying with you both, I said. I actually encouraged the opposite, the whole time. I watched him send those messages. I watched him wait for a response that never came. I want to describe the conversation Ryan and I had once Kelly had shared this discovery with both of us, because I think his reaction mattered significantly to how the rest of the situation unfolded. Ryan was quiet for a long time after Kelly's call, processing, I think, the specific vindication of finally having concrete proof of something he'd known privately for over a year but had never had a way to definitively demonstrate to anyone outside our own household. I kept those messages, he said, finally, without really thinking about why. I think some part of me knew, eventually, they might matter. I just didn't expect it to take this long, or for Kelly to be the one who found them by accident. How do you want to handle this now? I asked him. I think Mom needs to hear this directly, from me, he said. Not just secondhand through Kelly. I think I need to show her those messages myself. Before he confronted his mother directly, Ryan and I spent a quiet evening together, and I want to describe what he shared with me during that conversation, because I think it captured something important about the emotional weight of finally having concrete proof of an effort that had gone unacknowledged for so long. I think part of me needed this too, he told me, not just to correct what Mom's been telling people, but for my own sake. I've spent over a year wondering if I imagined how hard I tried, whether I was somehow remembering it more generously than what actually happened. Reading back through those messages myself, seeing exactly what I wrote and exactly how long I kept trying before I finally stopped, it's strange having outside proof of something I already knew was true. I told him I understood that feeling completely, having watched him send those messages in real time, understanding, even then, how much effort and hope he'd poured into a relationship that kept refusing to meet him halfway. You don't need the messages to know you tried, I told him. But I understand why having them helps anyway. I think it's because trying, quietly, without anyone acknowledging it, starts to feel almost like it didn't happen, he said. Having it documented somewhere makes it real in a way that just remembering it privately never quite managed to. I want to describe the conversation Ryan eventually had with his mother, once he'd decided to address the situation directly, because I think the specific content of that conversation mattered enormously to how thoroughly the narrative was finally corrected. Ryan showed Susan the messages himself, scrolling through them slowly, reading several aloud. I sent this the week after our fight, he told her. I sent this a month later. I sent this 3 months after that, still trying. You never responded to any of it, Mom. Not once. And this whole time, you've been telling people Claire did this to us. Susan, according to what Ryan told me afterward, cried throughout much of this conversation, a specific, genuine distress that Ryan described as different from her earlier, more defensive reactions to Kelly. I don't have a good explanation, she reportedly told him. I think I was too hurt and too proud to respond, and somewhere along the way, it felt easier to believe someone else had caused the distance than to admit I'd let my own hurt keep me silent. I want to describe more of this conversation, as Ryan later relayed it to me in detail, because I think the specific back and forth mattered to understanding exactly how thoroughly it corrected the narrative that had been circulating for over a year. Why didn't you just tell me you were still angry? Ryan reportedly asked his mother. Instead of just going silent, and then telling everyone Claire had done this? I think I didn't fully understand my own reasons at the time, Susan told him. Being angry at you felt too painful to sit with directly. It's easier, somehow, to be angry at someone else, especially someone I already had complicated feelings about from the beginning. Complicated how? Ryan asked. I think I never fully let go of some version of you as still needing me the way you did as a child, Susan admitted. And when you started pulling toward your own life, your own marriage, I think some part of me needed an explanation that didn't require me to accept that you'd simply grown into your own adult, with your own choices I didn't always agree with. I found this admission, once Ryan relayed it to me, genuinely useful in understanding the deeper psychological root of what had happened, not a simple misunderstanding, but a specific, if painful, pattern of a parent struggling to accept a child's independent adulthood, redirecting that difficulty toward an easier, more external target. I asked Ryan, once he'd relayed this conversation to me, whether his mother had offered any further explanation for why she'd specifically constructed a narrative blaming me, rather than simply describing the estrangement without assigning specific fault. I asked her that directly, Ryan told me. She said it was easier to believe you'd taken me away than to accept that I might have pulled back on my own, because you were somehow more bearable to be angry at than the idea that I'd genuinely wanted distance from her specifically. I sat with this explanation for a long time, understanding it as a specific, if uncomfortable, insight into how blame sometimes redirects itself toward whoever's easiest to villainize, rather than toward the more difficult truth of a parent's own role in a relationship's deterioration. I want to describe a family gathering that took place several weeks after this initial confrontation, because it represented the first opportunity for the corrected narrative to be acknowledged more broadly among the extended family members who'd absorbed Susan's original, false version. Susan, to her credit, addressed the situation directly at this gathering, without needing Ryan or me to raise it first. I want to say something, she told the assembled family. I've been telling people, for over a year, that Claire pulled Ryan away from us. That wasn't true. Ryan tried, repeatedly, to keep us connected, and I was the one who never responded. I got that completely backward, and I need everyone here to understand the actual truth. I want to describe the specific relief of hearing this correction delivered publicly, in the same setting where the false narrative had originally spread, understanding exactly how much it mattered to have the record set straight among people who'd absorbed a genuinely damaging characterization of me for over a year. I want to describe the conversation I eventually had directly with Susan, once the broader family correction had been made, because I think it mattered to me personally to address the situation with her myself, rather than letting Ryan and Kelly's conversation stand as the entire resolution. I need you to understand something, I told her. I never once discouraged Ryan from maintaining a relationship with you. I actively encouraged it, the entire time, even when it was clearly difficult for him. The narrative you constructed didn't just misrepresent a general situation. It specifically attacked my character, to people who had no way of knowing it wasn't true. Susan was quiet for a long moment. I know, she said. I think I needed someone to blame, and you were easier to blame than my own son, or myself. I'm genuinely sorry for the harm that caused you, specifically, not just for the confusion it caused generally. I want to describe, honestly, how the relationship between Ryan's family and us evolved over the following months, because I think the gradual, uneven nature of that evolution matters more than a clean, simple resolution would. Susan began making genuine, consistent efforts to rebuild connection with Ryan directly, responding promptly to messages, initiating contact herself rather than waiting for Ryan to reach out first, a specific reversal of the pattern that had defined their relationship for well over a year. My own relationship with Susan remained more cautious, understandably given how directly her false narrative had targeted my character specifically. I noticed her making deliberate efforts, over time, to include me genuinely in family conversations, to ask about my own life directly rather than filtering interactions primarily through Ryan, small but specific signs of an attempt at genuine repair rather than simply resuming a relationship as though nothing significant had happened. People who hear this story sometimes expect me to say I confronted Susan immediately, the moment I first learned of her false narrative, rather than waiting over a year for an accidental discovery to finally correct it. I didn't, and I think it's more honest to say so, even though the more proactive version might feel more satisfying to imagine. What actually happened was more complicated. A false, damaging narrative about my character persisted for over a year, sustained by a mother-in-law's need to assign blame elsewhere rather than examine her own role in her son's pulling away. It took an accidental discovery, Kelly cleaning out an old phone, to finally surface the concrete evidence that definitively corrected a story that had circulated, unchallenged, for far too long. I used to think false narratives about my character would eventually resolve themselves, simply through the accumulated evidence of my actual, ongoing behavior. I've since learned that a narrative, once it takes root and gets repeated consistently enough, can persist independent of contradicting reality, sometimes requiring a specific, concrete piece of evidence to finally, definitively break its hold. I found myself, in the months since this happened, sharing a version of this story with several friends navigating their own complicated in-law dynamics, particularly situations where blame for a relationship's difficulty gets assigned in ways that don't match the actual, underlying reality. Document things when you can, even informally, I tell them, not because you expect to need proof, but because you never know when a false narrative might require concrete evidence to correct. Ryan never anticipated needing those messages as proof of anything. He was just genuinely trying to reconnect with his family. But keeping that record, even accidentally, ended up mattering enormously once the truth finally needed to be established. My relationship with Ryan's family today exists in a considerably more honest, if still evolving, form than what existed before this correction. Susan and Ryan have rebuilt a genuine, if still occasionally imperfect, connection, one built now on more direct communication than either of them had previously practiced. My own relationship with Susan remains a work in progress, built on a foundation that requires more active effort and genuine accountability than either of us had extended before this happened. I don't know if we'll ever have the kind of easy, unguarded relationship some mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law manage to build. But I've made peace with a version of that relationship that's honest about its own history, rather than one built on a false narrative I was never willing to simply accept. The first major holiday gathering after this entire situation was resolved gave me a clear measure of how much had genuinely shifted since Kelly's accidental discovery had forced everything into the open. Susan called me directly, several weeks in advance, something she'd never once done before in the 5 years I'd known her. I wanted to ask you directly, she said, what you and Ryan might like to do for the holiday this year, rather than just assuming and planning around what I think should happen. I found myself genuinely moved by this small, specific gesture, not a grand, dramatic reconciliation, but a simple, deliberate act of actually asking rather than assuming, exactly the kind of small correction that felt, cumulatively, more meaningful than any single apology could have been on its own. The holiday itself unfolded with a specific ease I hadn't experienced with Ryan's family in years, Susan asking genuine questions about my own work, my own family, rather than filtering every interaction through evaluation or comparison. I don't want to suggest the day was perfect, or that every old pattern had fully disappeared. But it was, unmistakably, different, in ways that felt sustainable rather than performed. I want to describe, briefly, how my own relationship with Kelly evolved following her role in uncovering the truth, because I think it represents one of the more genuinely positive outcomes of this entire difficult situation. Kelly and I had never been especially close before this happened, our relationship existing mostly in the polite, surface-level form that in-laws sometimes settle into without much deliberate effort in either direction. Her willingness to confront her mother directly, and her genuine remorse about her own role in letting the false narrative persist, created an unexpected foundation for a considerably closer relationship than we'd ever had before. I think finding those messages changed something in how I think about silence generally, she told me, several months later. I used to think staying quiet was the safer choice, in almost any conflict. I don't think that anymore. I think silence let something false stand for over a year, and I don't want to make that mistake again, with you or with anyone else in this family. If there's a lesson in this, it's one I carry with me now every time I think about that group chat, sitting unanswered on Ryan's phone for over a year, containing the exact, concrete proof of an effort that had been happening the entire time someone else was busy constructing a story that erased it completely. The actual truth, patiently documented even without any specific intention of needing it later, ended up mattering considerably more than any argument any of us could have made in the moment blame was first assigned. I don't think Ryan sent those messages, 18 months earlier, imagining he'd eventually need them as evidence. I think he simply wanted his family back, and kept trying, long after most people might have stopped. I don't know if Susan will ever fully understand why it felt easier, for over a year, to blame me rather than sit with her own role in her son's pulling away. But I know that the actual record of what happened, patient, documented, and finally read aloud in the exact conversation where it mattered most, settled the matter completely, the moment someone finally thought to look. If you've ever been blamed for a distance you didn't create, I'd love to hear how you eventually corrected the record, and what it took to get there. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.